It's an addiction when I know that it is causing pain. I know that it's causing destruction. I don't want the pain to continue, but I keep doing it. There's going to be part of me going, I want to do the thing, but there's also a huge part of me going, I don't want to do the thing. And I definitely don't want to cause pain and destruction to myself and to my family and to other people, but I keep doing the thing. My primary monster, my primary addiction. And this is something that started out with porn. Over the course of years, it progressed. Me chasing after every hit I could get in terms of objectifying women and seeking attention from women. I hated the fact that I was a dad, not because of my kids, but because they had me. I hated the fact that I was married, not because of my wife, but because she had me. That's a terrible way to live, but that was my life.
Would you call that shame?
Oh, absolutely. I lived in shame.
Welcome to the Derelict Podcast. For the disparaged, depleted, and delinquent souls trying to find our way, we're talking about the scary part of the journey, where we don't know how it'll end. Let's be free to face our fucking failures in real time as the most unadulterated, truest version of who we are. No sugarcoating. Welcome to the shit show, you derelict.
Hey, derelicts. Welcome to another episode of the Derelict Podcast. I, as always, am your host, Josh Abandonato, and we have another guest, a very special guest here today, Logan Hufford. Logan, thanks for being here,
Josh,
man.
I appreciate you having me on.
Appreciate you taking the time.
You.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Logan is in Alaska, right? A beautiful place that I've never been, that is still on my bucket list. And you're married, you got 4 kids. You guys explore the wilderness a lot up there or what?
I'm learning to. I'm 34 years old, and it took me I'm not joking, it took me about 3 decades to appreciate the state that I live in. And my wife she's a 4th generation Alaskan. She's all about camping and getting out there and fishing. And so I'm learning to enjoy those things and do them more.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I live in the Pacific Northwest, which is obviously not the same as Alaska, but I think there's a lot of similarities on how people like being outdoors and that sort of thing. And there are still a ton of people here that do not enjoy it. They don't understand it. It's in their backyard. And especially the ones that have never traveled anywhere and realize like how incredibly beautiful it is here. And I'm sure you experienced that with Alaska as well, is that, sometimes when beauty's all around you, you just take it for granted, 100%. Right? Maybe we'll talk about that today on the podcast. I don't know. We'll see.
It's a common thread that will pop up throughout my story. So yeah,
I'm sure it will. So y'all, I invited Logan on the podcast today because I was really interested in his story. Some of my background has similar aspects to Logan's story, so it really resonated with me a lot. And the other reason it really resonated with me is that if you're listening to this right now or watching this, I'm going to ask you a question. And here's my question. My question is, what do you use to medicate? I wouldn't necessarily say you have to use the word addicted or be an addict, because a lot of people shy away from that word until they actually own that as a part of their being, as a part of who they are. But here's the question. When you go through something difficult, no matter what that is, and there's some sort of emotion that you don't want to feel, some sort of experience that you don't want to feel, you want to check out. That's another way of saying it. So if you want to medicate, you want to check out. What do you usually use? And one of the reasons I wanted to bring Logan onto this podcast is because when you're on social media, a lot of the times when addiction is talked about, it's talked about as, well, here's this meth head on the street that doesn't have a job, lives in a tent, is a disaster, is slowly dying. Right? I'm sure you've experienced that before too, Logan, as well, right? Like addiction is always thought of as, if I can visually see it and it viscerally changes me, then that person's obviously an addict. So we see the person that's in the bar all the time, the alcoholic that's just drinking and driving and almost killing people and hitting deer with their car and all this crazy shit that they're doing, right? We see, again, the meth head that's living on the street that literally can't even have a conversation with anybody because they're so far gone. And those addictions, I would say, again, they're visceral because they're visible. I have found in my life that most addictions, or most ways that I've medicated, or most ways that I've tried to avoid my feelings, have been much more insidious. They've been much more behind the scenes. Maybe for you, anyone that's listening, watching this, maybe it's shopping. Maybe you just have to obsessively buy stuff and Amazon Prime is always at your door 5 times a day. Maybe it is the alcohol or the drugs. Maybe it's workaholism, which doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Maybe all you ever do to try to avoid any problems in your personal life is you just go work harder and you're just like, yeah, forget all this stuff. I'm just going to work harder. Maybe it is eating. We have an epidemic in this country of fat people that eat too much food. And people don't even want to say that anymore because it's offensive somehow. Why is it offensive? If you're eating a bunch of shit, you're going to look like shit. It's just a reality. Maybe it is other addictions. Maybe it's lust. Maybe it's sex. Some of the things that we're going to get into today. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's relationships. Maybe it's, I always have to be with this soulmate and I'm completely addicted to this other person. So I don't know about you, Logan, but I've found in society, at least, it seems like there are certain addictions or medications or things that are more socially acceptable to talk about and more easily visible. And then there's the ones that are behind the scenes. Have you experienced this at all? And does this relate to your story at all before we get there?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm nodding along as you're going through these different examples. And part of that is because I understand what you're saying. A lot of it's because I've seen it in my own life. In different ways, as you alluded to. Not every one would I call an addiction, but I have absolutely medicated in pretty much every area that you described. And I always give the examples of, my addiction. I didn't have track marks on my arm and, bloodshot eyes and sitting in a box, on the side of the street asking for money. But the phrase you used, and when you said those words, it was like to me, hearing it was like a mic drop. Slowly dying. Because that was absolutely me. Absolutely slowly dying. And just wondering when it will happen. Not literal death, although there was part of me that wanted that. But when are the things that are in my life that are incredible that I'm absolutely not appreciating and cherishing, my wife, my kids, when are those things just going to evaporate? Because it's going to happen. I knew it was just going to happen. And I felt like there was nothing I could do to stop it.
That's interesting. So I do want you to tell your story here in a moment and whatever piece you feel comfortable sharing, because I know that this can be a very vulnerable moment with us dealing with these things. But what I'd love to hear through this story as well, and you just referenced it, which I think is really, really key. How do you know the difference between like medicating and it becoming an addiction? In other words, how do I know that I'm just checking out every once in a while? So like, let's take an alcoholic because maybe it's an easier example, and then we'll hear your story and we'll talk about this, right? So there's often, I've heard questions of like whether a person's an alcoholic or not. How do you define that? Because there are plenty of people in the world that can go have a drink or two and be completely fine, be completely in control of themselves, control of their emotions, control of their actions, right? They have a drink or two, not a big deal. A true alcoholic can't have a drink or two because it never stops at a drink or two, right? It always goes from a drink to 2 to 3 to 4 to passed out to blacked out to doing stupid shit, right? And I found that to be true with other ways that we medicate too. Food is a perfect example. We all need food as nourishment to live. But when does food become an addiction? Well, probably when I choose the food instead of actually dealing with my own emotion, right? So how about this? Let's start with your story, because I want people to have background of what we're talking about. And I would love to just hear what you got into. And then maybe if there was a moment or a time period, et cetera, where you felt like this medicating or this just checking out every once in a while turned into an actual addiction that you couldn't control. Does that make sense?
Darn it. I was getting all prepped to answer your question. You're not going to let me. But
which question was that? Answer the other question then. Medicating to the addiction?
I absolutely, I think there's so much value in asking that question and then in thinking through the answer to that. And so I'm going to share, this is my thought on it, which is it's an addiction when I know that this thing that I'm using to medicate, that I'm running to, I know that it is causing pain. I know that it's causing destruction. I don't want the pain to continue, but I keep doing it. I mean, for a layperson's definition, that to me, that's a pretty good working definition of addiction. And even
so there's something that's causing pain that I don't want to continue to do because I don't want that pain to continue, but for whatever reason, I don't feel like I can stop.
And of course, there's going to be part of me going, I want to do the thing, but there's also a huge part of me going, I don't want to do the thing. And I definitely don't want to cause pain and destruction to myself and to my family and to other people, but I keep doing the thing. So for me, I mean, my primary monster, my primary addiction, because I had multiple, but the one that absolutely I was living in bondage to for years was sexual addiction. And this is something that started out with porn. Technically, it didn't even really start out with porn. I can explain what that means. And over the course of years, it progressed. Addictions don't stay static. And it got to the point where I was so used to, I trained myself to chase after new and different and more dopamine and a new hit, a new high, and something that me chasing after every hit I could get in terms of sexually objectifying women and seeking attention from women, that when I got married, June 4th, 2011, I'd already cheated on my wife, my then wife, or my now wife, I guess at that point. I cheated on her multiple times, would go on to continue cheating on her. And this was including porn. This was including physical affairs, hiring prostitutes, phone sex lines. I mean, the whole gamut. And there absolutely was a huge part of me that wanted to chase after those things. I wanted to feel the pleasure of those highs, those forbidden fruits kind of thing. And especially as we were married and we started having kids young. I mean, 11 months after we got married, we had our firstborn. We had 4 boys in 5 years. So by the time I'm 23, 24, we've got multiple kids. I'm coming home to this incredible wife, incredible boys. This, like, our Christmas card photo would look like a white picket fence, perfect little family, right? And I'm hating myself. I'm hating my life. I hated the fact that I was a dad, not because of my kids, but because they had me. I hated the fact that I was married, not because of my wife, but because she had me. That's a terrible way to live, but that was my life.
Would you call that shame?
Oh, absolutely. Shame. I lived in shame.
Yet you couldn't stop, or at least felt like you couldn't stop.
I felt like I could not stop. I didn't envision a life where I wouldn't continue looking at porn, where I wouldn't continue flirting with every woman I came across, where I wouldn't have affairs at least, once or twice a year. I could not envision a future where that wasn't the reality.
But, with whatever you want to share, what sort of pain or insecurity or discomfort, etc., was that helping you medicate?
So this is on one hand, kind of interesting part of my story, and on another hand, maybe it's really boring, is that there is no like specific trauma point in my life where this stemmed from. There was not an abusive background that I can't, like, my upbringing was, there's no perfect family, but I mean, it was a solid upbringing, healthy family, generally speaking. I was loved. I was cared for. I felt safe. And yet I chased after this stuff. Go ahead.
Let me just pause you for a second though, Logan, with the way that you just worded that question. And I'm just going to encourage you with something that actually is really encouraging to a lot of people listening right now. And here's the reason why. Because what I've found with my experience with men who have dealt with addiction, including myself, is that if we don't have some sort of like insanely traumatic, terrible childhood, that can produce its own flavor of of shame, excuse me. That can produce its own shame, because it's like, well, I don't have the right to be stuck into this. I don't have the right to fall into this addiction because there's no reason I would be here. So I would really encourage you, brother, that there's a big piece of your story that's actually, I think, much more powerful than that person that does have that extreme example, because what it shows people is it shows people that are listening or watching right now that might be struggling with this, that it's okay that you're struggling with this, even if there's not some sort of huge trigger point. And that is based on what I said at the beginning of the episode. That's where this stuff is so insidious. Because if you can't, as men too, right? We like to track things and we like to figure out why something happens, and it's in our logical brains, right? So, but if I can't track it, where the hell did it come from? And if I can't figure out where the hell it came from, then I don't have any excuse. So I should just, pick myself up and just stop doing it, right? Because there's no reason for me to do it anyway.
No, 100%. And what you just said, I mean, as far as like, I don't have a right to feel this, or I don't have a right to struggle in this way. Like, hearing somebody else say it, it sounds pretty dumb. It sounds pretty silly, but I felt that way. I've so felt that way. And so, like, to actually answer your question, I mean, there's one thing that I can point to that was a factor. Wasn't like a specific moment in time. Definitely not blaming anything on it, but it was a factor. Is, as a kid, I felt ugly. I always felt like girls wouldn't like me. And I've never been a shy person, but I was very shy around girls my age because of that, because the fear of rejection. Right. And I always wanted a family. And I'm talking about, like, as an 8-year-old kid, I wanted to, like, play house with my siblings, or, with the kids at church. Like, I wanted to, like, pretend I was like a dad, and so there's nothing wrong with that, right? That's a pretty healthy aspiration. But if you couple those two things, I want a family, I want to be a dad, I want to be a husband, but girls aren't going to like me, women aren't going to, and I don't remember how much I, like, thought through all those things, but I did have those two things kind of doing battle inside, right? And as I got older, and older teen, young adult, really with that, and that's about how old I was when I first started, like, putting myself out there, seeking attention, starting to flirt with girls my age. And then when I started to realize, oh, okay, I can get girls' attention. I can get a girl to want to spend time with me or talk with me. And again, it's like, in and of itself, very normal thing. Nothing inherently wrong with that. But I wanted that. I wanted that so badly. And I would take whatever version of that, even, of course, including, a fake version, porn, right? And so I just, this compulsive chase of attention, this compulsive chase of a woman to like me, to want to spend time with me, whether it was, full-blown sexual or primarily emotional or something else, or everything. But I would take what I could get. And the older I got, I mean, by the time I was in my early 20s, I became a predator. I mean, I don't back down from that word. I wasn't on a list, but I was a predator. I trained myself to chase after and take what I could get from basically every woman in my path. And it became my MO. It became how I interacted with the world around me, how I interacted with life, to where it was no longer a coping mechanism. It was no longer, me trying to satiate this need, or I mean, that still existed. But just like, the alcoholic who may have started out because they were partying as a teenager, well, now they're not doing it because it's so fun. They're doing it because they do it. Right. And that is what it became for me. Whereas this is just how I do life, and I hate it, and it sucks. There's still fun. There's still pleasure in it, but there's so much darkness. There's so much shame. I'm seeing the destruction on my wife's eyes when I confess that I had another affair, and she's laying on the bathroom floor screaming. She's laying on the bathroom floor crying. And tomorrow I'm going to be flirting with a woman at work again. Tonight I'm going to be looking at porn again. I mean, that was just reality for years.
I love the fact that you used a word that most people would not use in your context, and that was predator. And here's the reason I appreciated it so much, is that there's a lot of honesty and authenticity and vulnerability in using that word. Because usually, I would say most people's mind, probably, even when you said that, like my mind did, we think of some person in a back alley trying to rape a woman, right? Like, that is something extreme, right? Something really predatory and extreme. But that couldn't that just also mean the like player or the guy at the bar or whatever that's just trying to manipulate women into sleeping with them?
Which is absolutely, that was my ideal. Like in the unhealthy part of me, that was what I wanted. I mean, and even that word player, like, and not to, I mean, this might come across as kind of goofy, but like as a kid watching movies, listening to music, hip hop, I love hip hop. Like I wanted to be the guy that, girls wanted to be with, and I'm gonna party with these girls. Like I wanted all that. Right. So now I can have that. Now I can have, I was a car salesman for 6 years. Most of my addiction, most of my acting out with women were women that were buying cars from me. The idea that, this girl here and that girl here and this woman over here, like I thought I was so cool. I thought this is awesome, especially, in the first year or couple years where it was beginning to be my MO with playing out these fantasies in real life. Especially, I felt shame before I got married, but it was nothing like the shame I felt after I was married. And then once we had kids, because even during like that 6 months before I got married, I'd had multiple sexual affairs. But I felt shame. I felt bad about it. I knew this is terrible, this is wrong, but I still believed this lie that I can turn it off once we're married. This is, I went way too far.
Right. As soon as I get married and I'm getting all my needs.
Yeah. It's just crazy. It's like this bachelor party thing. Like, but like, then we'll be married and I'll settle down, as if there was an off button that I could just hit. And then that off button does not exist.
Yeah. Yeah. As if you don't follow yourself into that marriage. Right.
Yep. It's a great way to put it.
Yeah. I love that. I also related to something else that you said a lot, because I would say, so, you said your primary sexual addiction was sex addiction or sexual addiction. And I would say that my primary addiction, I've tried to figure this out throughout the years. And this is going to be one people are going to be like, that's not even an addiction. So just bear with me for a second. I think my primary addiction still to this day is validation. It's validation. It's external validation. It's not the validation I have within myself. And the reason that I think that that's my primary addiction is because even yesterday is a great example. Excuse me, I wrote an ebook yesterday in a day. First time I've ever done that before in my life, but it was just flowing. It was flowing. Call it spirit or intuition or whatever you want to call it. It was just flowing through the pages. I wrote the whole thing. It was amazing. And I live as a single man. My kids are with me sometimes they're not. And what I noticed right after I wrote that book is that I immediately wanted validation. I wanted somebody to tell. And I'm sitting here in my house by myself, so there's no one to tell, right? And what I realized even more so than that is I didn't just want validation from a buddy of mine. I really wanted like my partner, who doesn't exist, to validate me. So validation from women is even more important to me than validation from men, even though both are important to me, right? Why do I bring that up? I bring that up because I have found in my life, and I'm curious if you have as well, that even if there's nothing to point to, I've never met someone who is really good and healthy at validating themselves and loving themselves and being comfortable with themselves that struggles with addiction. Not once. Right? Yeah. And I think that's why I'll keep coming back to the word insidious, because I just think it's the best word to use. I think that's why some of these addictions, like sex addiction, are so insidious. Because let's just take our culture for an example, right? Like, obviously, sex addiction is celebrated everywhere.
Right.
Isn't it? I mean, there's TV shows about guys that go around to bars and try to sleep with as many women. One of my favorite from back in the day is How I Met Your Mother. Barney Stinson is the perfect example of that, which is hilarious because obviously, Neil Patrick Harris is gay in real life and has no feelings for women. But in the show, he plays the perfect player that's always just trying to hit on women all the time. And it's glorified. It makes it look good.
You very rarely see the dark side that absolutely exists for that. Even for somebody that's not married, that doesn't have kids, they're not cheating on it. But there's a dark side that absolutely exists. And of course, that is almost never going to be shown.
And we also live in a society too, where, you know, some of these guys on social media, especially really well-known guys, that some of which, if I even say their name, I get my videos removed from social media now because they're so crazy as far as the impact that they have, but which has happened to me multiple times now at this point. But a lot of these guys have really good ideas about masculinity and what it means to be a man, and they've done really well with themselves successfully, with their business, with their body, with their mindset. And I look up to a lot of the things that they say, but it seems like one common thing with a lot of these men that I never look up to is that there's this idea as a man that you can just go out and just have sex with as many women as possible to conquer as many women as possible, as they often talk about it, which is fucking terrible. And it doesn't do anything to a man. There's this idea among pop culture that a man can do it, but a woman can't. If a woman does it, then there's emotions and there's feelings and part of their soul goes with this man, etc. But a man can do it. Doesn't mean anything for a man. You can just have sex with whoever you want. You can swap fluids with whoever you want, and it's never going to affect you. So there's already this built-in shame of you even saying that you're a sex addict as a man, because what's wrong with that? Who cares? Isn't it your goal and your job to go out and have sex with as many women as possible? Like if a woman said it, it's like, oh no, that's, you know, but if a man says it, you're like, what?
I mean, even one thing about me, I mean, you probably picked this up, you definitely will, is I tend to speak from my perspective for a couple reasons. I mean, part of that's because of recovery. I mean, in recovery program, that's a huge piece of it is extreme ownership. I talk about what's the stuff I'm working on. I'm not going to talk about we or they or us very, very often.
Right.
But it absolutely connects with what you're saying. When I first started, this was before I even got traction in recovery. This was several months before I even got sober. But when I first started to reach out, I started to go to some meetings. I started to do some things differently. This is the summer of 2015. And I was still a car salesman at this point. And I had a couple different buddies that we did a lot of things together. And we'd, go out drinking after work, and we'd, chase after women together. And so but I was open about that. Yeah. Like I'm going to these SAA meetings at Sex Addicts Anonymous. I'm going to these meetings. I'm trying not to do this. Like, I don't want to keep cheating on my wife, and they were, to their part, like they were supportive. I mean, they because I was married. Right. That was the one reason why they could see an issue with it is, well, yeah, cause you're married and you got kids. Like, you probably shouldn't be doing that. But otherwise there would have been no issue. And there absolutely was. I mean, there would be some of these comments, and they didn't hurt me. They weren't like offensive to me, because I understood where they're coming from. It's just like basically saying the same things you just said, which is like, yeah, but like, I'm not going to stop. I'm single, or, well, I'm not going to stop. I'm divorced. Like, what, I'm not going to stop that. And it's just, I mean, whether it's strictly porn, whether it's strip clubs, whether it's full on having sexual contact with every woman I can, I'm training myself to chase after these things. If I continue to do that, I'm continue to training my brain that this is something I should be doing. And something, I mean, I'll rail on this a little bit. I don't come on podcast to preach, but I believe this wholeheartedly. I mean, there's something that porn does that doesn't actually necessarily happen with physical contact, which is, I mean, I'm not ranking offenses. I'm not here to, but it's just is a true fact. If I'm chasing after porn primarily, that actually allows me to chase after these hits, chase after these highs, train my brain in all these ways with no rejection, with no risk of a physical human being getting mad at me or spurning me, right? Or hurting my feelings, right? And so I'm not here to tell anyone that porn is worse than going out and having sex with somebody at work. But it does do something that having a physical affair actually doesn't do, because it allows me to be the little kid in the candy store and take whatever I want and have whatever I want, however I want it, whenever I want it, as often, change the hair color, change this, change that. I mean, which is just a whole other piece of this that absolutely does not get talked about enough, which is the destructive nature of porn. But I mean, yeah,
and I agree with you. It can be worse. I mean, it's like, I have 3 kids, not as cool as you, but I have 3 kids, and here's what I don't want my kids to grow up as. And if you're a dad or a mom listening to this, tell me if you agree with me or not. Write it in the comments. If you disagree with me, tell me you disagree with me. But here's what I don't want my kids to grow up being: living in fantasy all the time. Now, what does living in fantasy mean? That doesn't necessarily mean have to be sexual. So I do not want my son to be a man boy that when he communicates with people, it's only via text or social media with no consequence of relationship. And when he tries to interact with a female, it's only through pornography, because none of that is real. None of that teaches any of the things that we all get to learn in relationship when somebody's face to face, when we're going through life together. You can't learn any of that. You cannot spend all of your time on social media and pornography and then expect to find this beautiful, long-lasting, amazing relationship and partnership with somebody. It's impossible. If you're training your brain that you just get that hit of dopamine or whatever whenever you want it from either your argument on social media or your sexual appetite on pornography, you will eventually get to a point where you cannot connect with another human being. And we've seen this a lot. We especially saw it through COVID. Why did people start becoming more lonely? Drugs went up, depression went up, suicide went up, everything went up. Why? Because there wasn't interaction with another human being. Because things like social media and pornography do not take away the human desire to be around other people and to connect with people and to look into their eyes and to be like, oh, I feel you. Like, I feel you. I love you. I feel you. Right? It just doesn't do the same thing. So I completely agree with you. Have you heard of the concept of soul ties before? Okay, yeah, you're a religious guy, so I figured you probably.
Well, full disclosure, I'd never heard that term until like 3 months ago. It was on a different podcast. Yeah.
Oh, was it? Oh, interesting. Okay, so I'll add actually in the show notes a link to the book of Soul Ties that I've read before. And again, fair warning for people that are listening that aren't religious. It definitely comes from a religious connotation, but I think that the meaning is valuable no matter how you take it. And the basic idea is, it actually comes from a biblical concept that when 2 people come together, they become one flesh. That's the concept it comes from. Now, again, you don't believe in the Bible? Great, wonderful. I don't really care. It's hard to argue with the fact that when you are connected with somebody and then you're disconnected, it's difficult. Unless you're a psychopath, when your relationship ends that you're close to, it's extremely difficult. And you can either choose to just jump back into another relationship because you can't handle it, or you can work on yourself. There's a bunch of different options that you can take. But the idea behind the book is that every time you have basically like a long-term intimate relationship with somebody, you are giving a part of your soul to them. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be long-term. It could just be a one-night stand as well. There's still maybe this portion in a one-night stand versus, this portion in a years-long relationship. Yeah, it could be different, but you're still giving a part of your soul to them, which means that you need to recover it. You need to get it back. And what I think is really interesting about the book is that once I read it, I learned about the concept, and I actually started practicing breaking soul ties with previous partners that I've had in my life. I all of a sudden found for myself, this is a selfish thing to say so that hopefully other people can learn from it. I found for myself as I was breaking these soul ties and I was taking back the piece of my soul that I gave to the other person, and I was giving them back a part of their soul. Every time I did this, and this is going to sound really woo-woo, but I actually did it out loud, and I've done it with every single serious partner I've had. Every single time I've done it, I've found more energy. I've found myself to be more alive. I've been more in my own body. I've accomplished more. I've written more books. I've done more podcasts. I've sold more clients, whatever, fill in the blank, every single time. So these men that get on social media and say that you can just sleep with as many people as possible and it has no impact on your soul are just flat out wrong. Don't listen to them.
Or as you alluded to, you can absolutely be a sociopathic monster who is completely frozen off. But I would hope that that's not the ideal anyone's going for. But that is another possibility.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Well, so, on this note, and I know that you host groups, right? Like sexual addiction groups.
Yeah, so I lead a local group here up here in Alaska for men struggling with sexual addiction.
Okay. So why do you think, going back to just men in our society and how it's talked about and what I even just said about how we, all of our leaders basically we glorify it. Like the other thing that just as a side note, maybe I'll just do a quick side note rant that I really drives me crazy, especially in politics, is when people start trying to take down political leaders for whatever inappropriate sexual thing they did, when it's glorified everywhere. Right. Like everywhere. Like don't, come on. Like if everybody's glorifying it and then we're like surprised that our leaders are doing it, are you kidding me? So here's my question though. Why do you think that it is so hard for guys to talk about this and to even get to a point where it's like, oh man, maybe this is a problem, or why is it so hidden that it's even an issue? What do you think?
There's two things that I think happen, and sometimes they happen at the same time, or a lot of times it's in one moment, one thing happens, and then maybe the next day, the next week, the next year, the other thing happens, which is I can feel if I'm struggling with this on any level, I can feel that fact of like, well, everyone's doing it. It's like you're saying, it's normalized. It's not such a big deal. Like it's cool, right? So maybe I'm full on wanting to do it because it's cool and it's glamorized, or bare minimum, it's going to kind of, it's going to minimize the shame. It's going to minimize. I can find ways to justify not feeling shameful. So that can definitely happen because everyone's doing it. And then this other thing can happen. I'm the only one that struggles like this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the only one that has a beautiful wife that is doing everything she can to be an incredible wife to me. I've got these incredible kids. I've got this incredible life given to me. Like we talked about at the start of this interview, taking things for granted, right? And yet I'm on my way to see a prostitute after work. I can feel like I'm the only one who's ever done that, or not the only one who's ever been with a prostitute, but I'm the only one who's this blessed and still throwing it away to go do that, right? And to believe those two lies, I'm the only one that's ever gone this far, and yet it's okay, it's normal. Those should not exist within the same universe of thought, but I've absolutely bought into both of those lies, and they're both BS, and they should be contradictory, but that is something, in my opinion, that absolutely is a big part of this foundational problem, because both of those lies, they can absolutely trap me if I don't have a healthy way out of it.
For sure. And addiction breeds in isolation. Yep. I'll say that again for everybody listening. Addiction breeds in isolation. It's the only way it works. It doesn't work if you have a bunch of loving people around you that are holding you accountable and wanting you to be a better man. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't. It breeds in isolation. And I was just going to say, isolation doesn't necessarily mean that you're by yourself either. So to your point, I could be hanging out with, you mentioned that story of you and your buddies, right? I could be hanging out with all my buddies and they're all doing it. And if I don't want to do it, maybe I still feel pressured to do it, or I feel like now I'm the weird one that's not doing it, or, but what I do is different. Like there could be some guys listening to this right now that are like, well, I've never paid for a prostitute, right? I'm not like Logan. I'm clearly not a sex addict because I've never paid for a prostitute. Okay. How does it show up for you? I know for myself, when I've struggled with this in the past, it wasn't, especially when I was married. Like when I was married, I never had an affair or hired a prostitute or anything else. And that's not saying I was better or worse than you. It just was the same thing. It manifested differently. So let me talk about how it manifested. It definitely manifested in pornography and some things like that. But you know again, I hate to keep using this word, but what was even more insidious than it showing up in pornography was showing up in just general lust. Just being in a room and not being able to stop looking at all the pretty women that walked in. And I'm not necessarily even visualizing having sex with them in my head, but just being obsessed. Just not being able to be present with my wife or my kids or whoever at the time because I'm just so distracted by shiny objects all over the place. I can't tell you how much more freeing it is, which is the next question I'm going to ask you about, like how to find freedom from this the guys are struggling with. But I just want to speak to the guys that don't think that they have a problem with this right now, or women that don't think that they have a problem with this right now. That's fine. But I'd really encourage you to try to become more aware if there's something that shows up, not for shame, but just because of the freedom that it provides. So, like I said, when I was in a really miserable part of my marriage and relationships, and frankly, it all came down to me not feeling validated, me unable to validate myself, me not feeling like I was taking care of myself, me frankly not taking care of myself is what it all came down to. Me not loving myself or respecting myself enough to just be the human that I was. When I was in that spot, it was easy for me to walk into a coffee shop and just be looking all over the place. And I can tell you now, years and years later after this, walking into a coffee shop and not doing that is extremely freeing. Some people think it's the opposite, right? Some people think, well, if I can't just go out to a bar and just have sex with any woman that I want, then I'm constricted, right? I'm not free to do whatever I want, to show my sexual self to whoever I want to. They feel like that's a constriction. And what I've found in my own life is no, it's actually the opposite. Yeah. Because what it is now is I get to choose. I get to choose who I'm going to look at. I get to choose who I'm going to go flirt with. I get to choose who I want to go have sex with. I get to choose who my partner is going to be. And that is empowering and that's freeing. That's not constricting. So for anyone listening to this right now, we both promise you, because I can tell Logan's raising, nodding his head right now, even though I'm not supposed to speak for him, but it is so much more freeing. It is so much more freeing having empowerment over that and not feeling a slave to it. So getting back to finding freedom versus being in bondage or slavery or addiction or whatever word you want to use, they're all basically the same word. What does this look like? How did you get to a point where you started finding some freedom, and what's, in your life, what have the benefits been?
And the idea of true freedom versus my ability to do whatever I want. Those are two very different things. And again, it's like a 5-year-old in a candy store would see them as the exact same thing, right? Freedom is me getting what I want when I want it. Me being a more mature, a more healthy person, not arrived, but more healthy and mature than I was, recognizing no, true freedom is, as you described, true freedom is the ability to do the thing that I find morally right. And that I mean, I don't care what, I do care, but no matter what somebody believes in, no matter what, everyone should be able to buy into that statement, right? Whatever I find morally right, I can choose to do that. I don't feel like I'm in a self-driving car going 100 miles an hour down the highway and I can't stop it, which is a freaking scary place to live. And that's where I lived, for years. And I'll share an example of what true freedom looks like versus, me being able to just do all the stuff that I impulsively want to do. But what started to get me there, the first thing that happened, in terms of like, because I see it as landmarks. I see it. I mean, I'm a Christian. I'm not here to preach to anyone, but I also, I share from that perspective, right? So I do see it as like God putting landmarks in my story and in my life. And one of the very first landmarks is my wife gave me an ultimatum. And this happened in the summer of 2015. I had confessed multiple sexual affairs. Basically, I would confess the worst of the worst.
But keep the rest back for yourself.
Well, because I I would confess the stuff that was like, okay, it's like, it's bubbling over. It's feeling so terrible. I'll share this and then I'll feel a little bit better. She's feeling terrible because I just confessed that I had sex with somebody, but yeah, I'm not confessing all the porn, all the flirting, but I'll confess the worst of the worst. Of course, I'm doing air quotes because that's not a healthy mindset, but that's where I was. So I did that over the course of years. Starting 6 months after we got married, that was the first time I ever confessed any of this to her. So summer of 2015, I got an ultimatum from my wife. And to this point, you know, I had confessed things to her. She had heard me confess that I had been unfaithful. Of course, she's in survival mode, right? She's a stay-at-home mom. We got 4 kids. She's trying to plan dinner and change diapers and keep our, you know, babies and toddlers alive and be the best wife she can be to me. And she's got no clue how to respond. And finally, in that moment, she did something that she'd never done before. And she stood up to her abuser. And she said, not these exact words, but she said, you know, I can't control what you do, but I can control how I respond to you. Right. And what she did say was, okay, if you do not get serious help, if you don't make some serious change, then I will leave and you will lose me and the boys. And I believed that she meant that. She's not someone that speaks rashly. So, you know, I alluded to this earlier. I said, I started to do some things differently. That's super weak verbiage, but it is accurate verbiage because I didn't just jump head first into recovery and be completely healthy. No. And there definitely was no off button. You know, it was, I started to invite resources. I started to attend meetings. I started to put myself out there. And it was almost a year before I actually started to get real traction. That was the end of July or the start of August of 2015. My sobriety date is May 19th, 2016, in terms of cutting myself off from pornography, masturbation, and sexual behaviors with other women. But during this process of starting to go to meetings and starting to talk to people and open up about this with other people who have experienced some healing in this area, I mean, this is where these landmarks started to appear. So the first landmark of, okay, things are not going to keep happening the way they have been is that ultimatum. And then at a group that was I'm not here. I love recovery. I'm all about recovery. Not all recovery groups are created equal. Just like not all therapists are created equal, right? I mean, and pretty shallow recovery group, relatively speaking. But at this group, I met this other guy, Rick, and he's my dad's age. So older guy, and he had, as I would come to know, he had decades of sexual addiction, and he had about maybe 10 years of sobriety and healthy living at this point. And he was like, hey man, I appreciate you're here. I'm glad you're here. You need more than this group. I needed more than this group is what he told me. And he's like, there's this group called Prodigals, and it's specifically for men struggling with sexual addiction, as this other group was just general recovery. And I'm like, he was like, it's going to be hard. It was the hardest thing I ever did. It was like boot camp. And I remember like, it's kind of scary. Like, oh, I don't know. That seems really intense. And let me just try to do the bare minimum. At one point I even said to him, I was like, hey, this is maybe like a couple weeks after we met. I was like, Rick, could we get together for coffee every now and again? And Rick has become my best friend outside of Carrie. He is like a dad to me. He is one of the most loving people that I know. And he looked me in the eyes and he goes, Logan, if you want to get together for coffee, I don't have time for you. And that was the second landmark. That was this, because that was somebody, I had spent years learning how to manipulate people, work the room, get my way, play enough of the vulnerable card, enough of the, you know, raw, authentic card to get you on my side. Right. But ultimately I'm going to get my way. And he wasn't having that. And then he quickly followed it up. He was like, if you want to seriously work on this, I will walk with you, but it's not going to be getting together for coffee a couple times a month. It's not going to be doing things your way.
Yeah. We're not getting together to bullshit. We're getting together.
Correct.
To work.
And he absolutely followed through on his promise. I mean, he personally mentored me through a 2-year voluntary house arrest program. Other guys were part of this mentorship team as well, but he personally was meeting with me for hours a week, taking phone calls, walking me through homework assignments. He's always going to be a mentor in my life. But I mean, during that 2-year period, I mean, he spent a lot of time and energy dedicated to me and to my family. And there are so many aspects to this program, to this time of my life, you know, that there were an aspect of healing, but ultimately what it boils down to is I had created this exoskeleton is how I think about it, that this is how I deal with life. Right. And like we talked about, you know, kind of started out for coping. It kind of started out as an escape. It started out because it felt good. And some of those things still existed. But by this point, it largely wasn't serving those purposes. It was just me. It was just how I lived. And this exoskeleton needed to get completely ripped off. It needed to get destroyed. And I couldn't just choose to not have this exoskeleton. And this is where it's really tricky. The idea of, like, you know, addiction and not being in control of my choices or being powerless to choose, which some of those phrases can get taken out of context, or they can even, I've heard people say them in ways that's like, dude, I don't agree with you. Where people go, hey, I've got a disease. You know, I can't control the fact that I have a disease. I can't control the fact that, and where it becomes a blame shifting thing. I take complete ownership of my choices. I made unhealthy choices. I made a series of unhealthy choices for years, and I own all that. Nobody made me do this. No, you know, a disease didn't make me do these things. But it's also true that I trained my brain, that I literally rewired my brain in a very destructive and corrupted way to operate in this manner.
Well, it's the same as anything else, right? I mean, you can go to any victim support group and find victims that live like victims, right? They're victims up here. Like, oh, it's everybody else's fault because of all these tragic things that happened to me. It doesn't mean that tragic things didn't happen. It's how you deal with them. So either you're going to treat yourself as, well, it's everybody else's fault because all these bad things happen to me, or you can find several people in those victim support groups that are there saying, no, I'm empowered. I'm in charge. I'm actually the victor here. This bad shit happened to me, but that's not who I am. Who I am is somebody who got through it and is healing and is moving forward and everything else. And the same thing is true in 12-step groups, recovery groups, everything else, right? You're going to find both. You're going to find the people that are like, oh, well, if my dad wouldn't have done this, or if my mom wouldn't have done this, or if my wife wouldn't have done this. Yeah, of course, we could all live as victims, but that is the most disempowering way to live. The empowering way to live is like, no, this all happened, and I still had a choice, right? Even if somebody has a gun to your head, you still have a choice. You might die, but you still have a choice. We always have a choice. And it's when we make our brains believe that we don't have that choice, that we live in victim mentality, and all bets are off.
And there are so many reasons why that is. I mean, I'll use your word, an insidious thing, because it doesn't seem as obviously destructive as other mindsets, I think, in a lot of cases, but it absolutely, because it robs me of choice. It robs me of any power that I have. And
everybody hits on women. Everybody looks at pornography. Everybody drinks. Everybody fills in the blank. Well, again, just because everybody does it doesn't mean it's good for your soul and your mind and your body and your spirit. Also, this is not a podcast. I mean, if this is the first time you've ever listened to a podcast, you might have this weird idea of this podcast being like super conservative or anything. This is not a conservative podcast by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not conservative by any stretch of the imagination. I've done plenty of things that are in all of these categories that we're talking about. It's not about that. It's about what's best for my soul. Yeah. How do I actually live, like you said earlier, how do I live out my morals and my beliefs for the best version of myself that I can be? And people are going to disagree on that. People are going to disagree with things that we've said on this podcast, and that's okay. I don't care if you think the best thing for your soul and your being is to have sex with as many women as possible. I would just encourage you to think about that and to actually look at the consequences of doing that. So, you know, a mentor of mine says this often, and I really love this quote. He says, there are no wrong choices. There's only consequences. And I love it because some might argue and be like, well, there are wrong choices, like murdering people, that sort of thing. No, there still aren't any wrong choice. Like if you believe in your heart that that is the best thing to do, great, go for it and do it. How am I supposed to tell you that that's not the right thing to do? However, there's going to be some consequences, right? If you hurt somebody that I love, I'm going to hurt you back, most likely. Right. That's your consequence, or somebody else's, or I'm going to bring in the justice system or whatever needs to happen. So sure, you can make whatever choices you want, and you can convince yourself, like I have so many different times, where like this isn't a big deal. Everybody does this. This is just a part of being a human. You know, I need to have sex because it's just a part of me being a man. And, you know, all these things that may be true, but applied in a way that doesn't actually help me become a better version of myself. Right.
And this is where the idea of a label of, you know, taking on that label of I'm Logan and I'm a recovering sex addict. I absolutely believe that it was important for me to say those words in recovery, not because it was a cop-out, not because I'm blaming anything on addiction. What it did for me, it simply identified the monster. It identified the problem, and it identified the stakes. I needed to do that. So for me personally, for me to say, well, I struggle with lust, I struggle with this, that would have been okay, but that wouldn't have been like lasered in enough for me. I needed to clearly identify, no. I'm a recovering sex addict. That sucks to say. I don't want to say that. And I'm not going to say it forever. Hopefully. I'm not going to have to say it forever that I'm this same person. Right now I am, though. When I first went to a group, when I first started in that program, I absolutely was someone who was hanging on by a freaking thread. And I needed to recognize that fact. I wasn't going to always hang on by a thread. And that's another thing that I see sometimes with like recovery talk and stuff on social media, is this idea that, I mean, it's kind of a straw man, but I see this crap out there that like, no, I'm always going to be hanging on by a thread. I'm always at risk. If I, you know, I mean, I'll pick on the alcoholics thing because it's something a lot of people can identify with. I'm always at risk of, if I touch that bottle, man, I don't know. I think I should get, not that I should get to a place where I can just start drinking again, but I should get to a place where even if someone put a bottle in front of me, I'm not going to be nearly as vulnerable as I would be day one. I should honestly, seek out that point.
I would agree with you. And it's so disempowering.
Correct.
I mean, you know,
it's scary. It's depressing.
It is. And let's pick on alcoholics for a second. Like there's a difference between somebody that has just realized and just accepted the awareness that they're out of control with their alcohol and they're just getting in the program. For that person to go hang out with their friends in a bar while everybody's drinking is extremely dangerous for them. If they don't want to be drinking, it is. There's a difference between that person and the person that's been in program for 20 years that has worked through all the steps. They have sponsees. They have a sponsor. They are true to themselves. They know who they are. They don't identify as an alcoholic anymore because they realize that that was only a part of them in the first place. That was never who they were originally. Like no one's an alcoholic. No one in their soul is an alcoholic. There is a part of them that acts like an alcoholic though. And that's really what it is. And that person is probably not only fine with, but probably happy to go in the bar, hang out with the people that are drinking so that they can be a good influence and they can still be good friends with them and everything else. Those are two different scenarios, right?
And there's
now that 20-year person might still not choose to do that because they still might not want to be in that environment, etc. But here's the other thing that I'll bring up another controversial subject. It's like therapy. It's the people that are in therapy for life. And my question always to them is, if you're in therapy for life, are you getting any better? Like, what are you doing there? Well, what's actually getting accomplished? Because if you're still there 20 years later talking about your childhood traumas, there's something wrong with this model. Shouldn't you have gotten to a point where you can move on from your childhood traumas and not live like a victim for the rest of your life? But what I found is that the people that I talk to that are in therapy forever are the people that are eternal victims. Because they just want somebody else to validate their victimhood. And I think the same thing can happen in groups like recovery and 12-step, where if I just walk in, then I can still be a victim to my alcoholism versus taking charge and control of it. And that doesn't mean that I always can control my behaviors, because clearly I couldn't control my behaviors, which brought me into this program in the first place, right? But that doesn't mean that you're supposed to live there forever. I mean, if anyone who's not familiar with 12-step, just go read the 12 steps of any 12-step program. It doesn't matter, because they're all the same. The only thing that changes is it's alcohol or drugs or sex or love or whatever. Besides that, every single step is the same. And the steps are very, very simple. It's like, this is out of control. I'm powerless. I need something that's bigger than me to try to help me do this. I need to give over my something to that higher power, that God, that universe, whatever you want to call it. And then I need to let go of a lot of this shit that's standing in my way. There's anger, there's resentment, there's fear. There's this stuff that's just eating away at me, and I need to let that go. I need to share that with another person. And then once I do that, then I can slowly start getting into the path where I can realize, like, what are the things that are holding me back? What are my defects of character is what they call them. What are the things that are making it so that I can't actually move on to the next stage of my life? And then once I figure that out, I have to start thinking about, man, who did I wrong during all this crazy behavior? Who do I owe an amends to? Which is not an apology. It's owning my mistakes in the different relationships that I've had. And then can I actually be honest enough to go share those with that person? And then if I can I go on this all-lasting spiritual journey that helps me get closer to God or universe or my higher power and my fellow man? And then can I help other people do the same thing? I just described the entire 12 steps. Tell me one individual, one human in the entire planet that would not benefit from what I just said.
I mean, that's something that I say, and more importantly, more powerfully than me saying it, my wife will say the same thing, because she got in recovery from betrayal trauma, from all the abuse that I'd put her through for years. And so she now leads women through that. And she would tell you, when she shares her testimony, she would not trade our story. She would not trade her story for anyone's. Because if things were not as broken and freaking hell on earth as they were, then obviously we never would have sought out recovery. If we didn't seek out recovery, we would not have this new infrastructure. Because it's not about like, oh, we got to recovery and I stopped looking at porn, I stopped cheating on her, and now we're back to where we were pre-betrayal. No. We didn't get back to center. We didn't fix it. Like, God flooded our life with people and changed our infrastructure and flipped things upside down to where things are completely different. The way that we approach life is completely different. The way that we approach each other, our kids, the world around us is completely foreign to how we used to do life. And I'm so thankful for that. And again, much more than just me saying that, that is something that she is very open about. I mean, the fact that we can, so she's not doing podcasts right now, just from a time and energy perspective, but like she will openly share, her story and our story. And for us to be able to do life together, to do recovery together, to work on after the stuff that I did. I mean, you talked about victim and the difference between being hurt, being wounded, and then being a victim. I mean, I'm blessed, and I literally every day I thank God for the example that I have for my wife, because there aren't too many people on earth that have the if they wanted to, they could fill out the notepad of all the ways that they're a victim, right? And that is not how she operates. She has done so much work to process through all that and work through that, and to be able to go through life and not instantly be triggered by every single thing, or to not just instantly go back in time to it. It's amazing.
That's beautiful, man. And I want to stop you right there too, because I just want to mention something that I'm like knocking over my camera like multiple times. I'm gonna mark that and take that whole thing out. Let's try that again. That was beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that. And I just want to pause you right there for a moment, because this feels very pertinent to me, just where I'm at in life and relationships and everything else. And I think, and I'm speaking this as a single man, so listen to me or don't listen to me, but I think what I've learned from all the romantic relationships, partnerships, etc., that I've been through, the one that I eventually want, whenever I'm ready for that, whenever this happens, I think it really comes down to probably one thing for me. And that is, I think the most beautiful relationships that I've ever heard of are the ones that are healing together. They're the ones that are in their version of recovery, whatever this means. I don't care if it's 12-step or something else, but their version of working on themselves, recovering, healing, and are completely committed to doing it themselves, not for the other person, because that never works. I heard somebody say the other day, and I don't remember where this quote came from, but he said, I'm not going to heal for you. He said, let me heal for me so that it heals you. And you heal for you so that it heals me, or something of that nature. And what I loved about it is the point is, I'm getting better and I'm healing so that I can be a better partner. And I want a partner that is getting better and healing so they can be a better partner. Yep. Because without that, that's why all of my relationships so far to this date have failed. All of them. 100%, I'm single at 40. 100% of them have failed. The reason that they've all failed is because of that one reason. There was one person in the relationship that was willing to work on themselves, heal, do the recovery, etc., and there's one person that wasn't. Every single one of my relationships failed for that reason. Or the darker of my days, where neither one of us wanted to work on ourselves, right? And I just think that that's beautiful, man. I think that that put you in a place with your wife where now you both are willing to do your own recovery, not for the other person, but for themselves. And what that translates to is a burgeoning relationship. So nice work.
Yeah, I mean,
that's awesome.
And she's open about the fact that, you know, when she got into recovery, she was fully aware that she's committed to this healing work regardless of what I did. I mean, maybe I get 6 months sobriety and then I flame out, and maybe I never take it seriously, or maybe I do. But regardless of what I was doing, she was willing to dive in. And it wasn't diving into betrayal trauma healing to fix the marriage. It was diving into betrayal trauma healing because she was somebody who had essentially been stabbed and left across the street from the hospital. So she can say, okay, I didn't cause this. It's not my fault. I didn't ask to be stabbed. Or she could drag herself to the hospital, even though it's not fair.
It's true. And the only thing that I know about any healing or recovery process or anybody working on themselves is that it never works long-term unless you do it for yourself. Right. It just doesn't. It doesn't matter who it's for. It doesn't even matter. Like, it's easier for me now to do it for my kids, right? As a single man with children. And it's easier for me to maybe sometimes put my head there, but it still doesn't work long term, because you still have to do it for yourself.
And I'm going to say this really quickly. When somebody is brand new, and that's a relative term, this could be 6 months down the road. This could even be a year into recovery. But within that first year or so, when I'm talking to a new guy at group, whatever motivates you to get here, cool. Let's use that, sure. Right? Like, because realistically, I actually probably have never met someone who has started out in addiction recovery for the most altruistic reasons. Agreed. And it's like we're not healthy, we're broken. That's why we're here, right? So yeah, I got into recovery so I could hopefully stop cheating so that my wife wouldn't leave me. That's why I got in. But what you're alluding to is that eventually should metamorphosize, right? Like that eventually needs to change.
There's no staying power there, because I completely agree with you. That's why I ended up getting into recovery and therapy and everything else when I did, was because my marriage was on the brink of ending, and then it ended. And then I figured out pretty quickly, like I dropped a lot of that stuff because I realized I was just in it to try to save my marriage, and my marriage was done. So why would I continue to do the hard work? And then it wasn't until I went through some more stuff where I'm like, no, I got to do this for myself. I can't do it for somebody else. So I agree with you. Whatever gets you there, great, stay there. But it doesn't have lasting power. That's not gonna last.
And the beautiful thing, and this is anecdotal, but at the same time, I can give a lot of examples of how this has played out. and I'm just going to use an I statement, but if I stay in recovery, it will naturally, like my motivations will naturally get healthier. They will kind of get boiled down and distilled into where a lot of the selfish crap that'll eventually go out. I mean, I'm always going to be at risk of being selfish because I'm a human, but my motivations will start to get healthier the further I go, because I'm not just
But isn't that true of every habit? Like you just got to show up, right? Like if I put on my walking shoes and go for a walk every single day, eventually my heart's going to be healthy.
Well, okay. I mean, yes and no, because here's what I mean by that. And this is where, again, I'm not here to diss on recovery, but I have seen a lot of recovery groups and programs and people where this is the number one goal: sobriety, not doing the bad thing. That is the goal. That's a freaking terrible finish line. That's not a finish line. That is a tracker. That's a way to quantify how long I have been on this track, but that's not the goal. The goal is to be a healthy person. The goal is to, in my case, be the type of person who like can deal with other humans and love them and be healthy and not prey on them. To love my kids and be honest with them and look them in the eyes, not because I'm perfect, but because I don't have secrets, because I don't have shame. Like those are goals, not masturbating or not going to a strip club. That's, again, maybe that's my initial goal, but that can't be my long-term finish line if I want to be healthy. And the term dry drunk is out there, right? And that's what I'm describing, is the person who's,
I was just gonna bring that up.
I'm not going to drink.
Right.
And that absolutely happens. And again, you don't have to go far. If you go looking for recovery content, you'll find that stuff out there, and it's so depressing. And so that is something that I just always emphasize, is there needs to be because what you had said as far as like, is it not always the case? And I sometimes it's not always the case where things will just naturally get healthier. And that's where every group is different. People have different types of mentors and sponsors.
I appreciate you saying that. Let me clarify what I meant. So if you haven't listened yet, go back and listen for the audience to, we've done several episodes on addiction, and one of which I spoke a lot about sobriety versus recovery. So let me explain that concept here real quick if you haven't heard that episode. So sobriety means I don't do the thing, whether it's sex, alcohol, drugs, whatever. Again, use this in terms of alcoholism because it's the most popular addiction around that people know about. Sobriety just means I'm not drinking alcohol, okay? And then recovery, though, means that I'm actively working my program. So I'm actively healing, I'm working through the steps, I'm going to therapy, I'm meeting with pastors, I'm doing whatever that means to you. That's what recovery is. Recovery actually has nothing to do with sobriety. And here's what I mean by that. Somebody could be an alcoholic going to a 12-step program, like you said, Logan, where they're not drinking alcohol, but they're not actively in recovery. They could show up to the meeting every single time, then not do any steps, not talk to their sponsor, not actually work on themselves at all. That's completely a thing. Or somebody could be in the program and they've been actively in recovery. They've gone through all the 12 steps, or they're working on the 12 steps, or they're working with a sponsor, whatever they're doing, and they're healing and everything else, and then they drink alcohol. Just because they lost their sobriety does not mean they lost their recovery. They're two different things. If I've been in therapy for 3 years working on my childhood trauma, and I've worked through most of my childhood trauma, and then I have a mental break one day and freak out, it doesn't mean that I lost 3 years of the therapy, right? Those are two different things. Yeah. And sometimes people hold sobriety to such a high level that if they lose that sobriety and they accidentally drink a beer one day, that all their recovery is gone. And that's bullshit. Right. That's not true at all. Because what ends up happening is that I would rather see somebody in recovery versus focusing on sobriety. This is what I tell everybody that I've ever met in a 12-step program. Focus on your recovery. Don't focus on your sobriety. You have to focus on sobriety at first because you have to get sober to get into recovery. You cannot be in recovery as a sex addict continually having sex with prostitutes. It doesn't work. Well, you cannot be in recovery for codependency or love addiction or sex addiction if you constantly are bouncing from one guy to the next, to the next, to the next, or one girl to the next, to the next, to the next, right? So I'd much rather see somebody in actively working on themselves, recovery, etc. So now, last point, and then feel free to say whatever you want. And that is, I just want to bring it back to your concept of dry drunk and just to expand on that a little bit more, because what a dry drunk is it is an alcoholic or any addiction that you want to pick that is living sober from that addiction. So again, if it's sex addiction and my sobriety is not having sex with prostitutes, then great, I'm not having sex with prostitutes. If I'm an alcoholic and my sobriety is not drinking alcohol, that means I'm not drinking alcohol. If I'm a drug addict and I'm addicted to meth and I'm not using meth, that means that I'm sober from meth, okay? So what a dry drunk refers to is somebody that is sober from whatever the thing is, but they're not only not living in their recovery, but they're still living as an addict. Yep. So an alcoholic can be an alcoholic and living like an alcoholic without drinking alcohol. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their head around. All that means is that they're still doing all the same stuff. They're still completely insecure in themselves. They're still not going inside. They're still not trying to find healing from themselves and their higher power and the people around them. They're still not engaged in the group, etc. Or, the other example, like, go back and listen to the episodes I did a couple months ago about my recent breakup and everything that I learned about that. But one of the things that, was true about that as well is that this shows up in relationships all the time, where I know that I'm in this unhealthy relationship. I leave the relationship, and then I don't take the time and the space and the healing that I need for myself. I just jump into another relationship. It's called a rebound for a reason, and it doesn't work because eventually I then get out of that relationship, even if it's 20 years later. And when I get out of that relationship, there's even more shit that I didn't deal with. It's even harder to deal with at that point. So that's the same as this dry drunk. That's like, well, if I just don't drink alcohol, I'm not going to have a problem. No, that's not actually fixing the problem at all. All right, I'm off my soapbox.
No, you're good.
What did you want
to
say?
I love it. And the one thing I was just going to jump in and say is, because sobriety coins, I really like sobriety coins. I don't like idolize them, but I think they're cool and impactful for me, at least, and for a lot of people.
So tell people what
a sobriety coin is like. Okay, first time I come to a meeting, first time I ever come to a recovery meeting, here's day one. Here's day one of recovery. Even though in that sense, I'm technically using the words recovery and sobriety interchangeably, but from that point on, it's tracking sobriety. So next week, I've gone a week without using, a week without, pornography, whatever. I get a 1 week coin, a 1 month coin, 6 months, so on and so forth. And initially it's 1 week, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and after usually a year, then the next one's 18 months, they start to get spread out more, and then it's annual. I do place value in them for a couple of reasons. Number one is, especially early on, the first 6 months of recovery, in some ways, maybe I could even say the first couple of years, but definitely the first 6 months, I didn't know how to be healthy. I didn't know how to think about myself in a healthy way. So how the heck would I know if I had any progress, right? Any progressive victory? So tracking me not going back to the thing, that's one way to track it, right? But again, it's a reference point. It's good. It's good for me to avoid that unhealthy thing, but that is not my salvation. That is not my healing, but it allows me, it kind of frees up my hands to do work is the way I think about it. So it quantifies it, because otherwise, if I'm not tracking anything, and this is where, if I'm in a 12-step group, well, it's 12 steps. So I can track where I'm at in the steps. And, so those are good things, but also there'd be those tough days where, whether I'm struggling internally, like I'm not acting out, but I'm struggling internally, or, I, as you alluded to, I'm doing something else unhealthy. I'm yelling at my kids, right? I'm being a jerk to my wife. It was nice to be able to go, and I've done this where it's like, I see my sobriety coin, and I see, okay, I've got a 7-month coin, or I've got a 1 year coin. And I can promise you that didn't make me feel like, it doesn't matter that I yelled at my kids. I've got a 7-month coin. I'm good. It doesn't matter that it didn't make me not feel bad about doing something bad, but it reminded me that bare minimum, I'm working on stuff. I'm not the same person I used to be. And that's good. Now, I don't want to keep yelling at my kids. I don't want to be a jerk to my wife, but I'm going to keep working on stuff. And just to segue back to your initial question, I started rambling when I was talking about the exoskeleton, but the recovery though I went in for pretty, looking back on it, fairly, short-term or selfish reasons of just like, I don't want to lose my family. What happened through recovery was that that infrastructure, that exoskeleton did get shredded. It did get removed. And it was, again, God flooding my life and the lives of my family with people who helped us, who counseled us, who gave us feedback. One of the biggest differences with the group that I was able to be a part of and the group that I now lead, this Prodigals group, is the strong encouragement and emphasis on feedback. If you attend 100 recovery groups across the nation, AA, Celebrate Recovery, NA, SAA, you are almost always going to find this. You will share how your week has been, your day has been, you'll share your story, whatever. And then maybe somebody pats you on the back. Hey, thanks for coming. But they're not allowed to say anything else. They're not allowed to ask you tough questions because it's supposed to be a safe space. The problem is a safe space usually gets exchanged for a comfort zone. Most leaders of those groups would never say that. They might not even realize that. But when I said like this one group that I met Rick at, it was a shallow group. There were people at that group that were doing good work. There were people at that group that were trying to love on other people and give back. But it was like most groups, it didn't allow for feedback. And so I could show up, work the room, right? Share just enough, be transparent, but not vulnerable, or not even fully transparent, but kind of be half transparent, right? And at Prodigals, guys would get in my face. They would call me out on my crap. Hey, you said this last week, and then you're saying this week. These two things don't match up. Or, hey, Logan, for the last 6 weeks, every Friday, this thing's happened at work, and then you respond this way. Like, why don't you start to do something differently on Friday afternoon so that and that's not allowed at most groups. But it's so crucial for me to learn how to be healthy, to learn how to use tools to interact with life, is guys speaking into my life and poking and prodding. And sometimes it sucks. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. I've been mad at lots of guys in recovery. Those guys that I've been mad at are some of the most precious people in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I could give tons of examples of how that played out, but ultimately that is such a crucial piece that needs to be there in recovery, is people not just loving me, not just holding me accountable, but through this process of giving me tough feedback and asking me tough questions. That has to exist.
For sure, man.
And like you said, that doesn't have to be a recovery group. That could be your therapist. That could be your pastor. That could be a really good friend. It's hard to find naturally, organically, but it can exist. Obviously in my case, it was primarily through the recovery model, but
yeah. And I think that's a really good point as we end here, that I just want to mention to everybody listening and watching this right now, is that, even though most of this episode itself has been focused more on like the 12-step model and recovery and that sort of thing, that doesn't mean it has to be found there. So, reach out to Logan. His information is going to be in the resources. He can give you some ideas. Also, just putting in a plug for myself, like we have a private Facebook group where men can come and just be open and honest and vulnerable with themselves in a very safe environment. We also have multiple groups of men meeting online and in person, where we are trying to facilitate this in a much bigger way than just like you have to have a sex addiction or you have to be an alcoholic or a drug addict or something in order to come in here. Because what I've found, at least for myself, is that it's really hard for men to do this. And it's really hard for men to just put down the shackles and be vulnerable and just be open with each other. And that takes time. It takes trust. It takes a safe environment. And it takes an environment, too, where even if men are going to challenge you, which they will in these groups, but even if men are going to challenge you, you still have to feel safety within that, right? You still have to feel like, oh, no, this is actually a person that I'm willing to challenge me. This is a person that I'm inviting into my life to challenge me, because men don't grow from anything but challenge. Disagree with that statement all you want. It's true. Men do not grow from anything but challenge. However, we don't listen to every single challenge we get, because if we get challenged from somebody we disrespect, fuck you and your challenge. I don't give a shit what you tell me. I'm not going to listen to a single word that you say if I don't respect you. So the idea behind these groups is to set up a group that has respect and trust built in so that when men challenge you, you hear it and you can accept it. And you might get defensive at first, but you might hear it then and then do something about it. So that's the idea. Man, Logan, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you. I appreciate you coming on, being vulnerable with your story, just being honest with how that's impacted you. I'm so happy that it's impacted you in such a healthy way. I'm so happy that you are sharing your message to so many different people. I'm so happy that it's impacted your wife and your family in such a way. And I know it's been inspiring to people. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. So to everybody else, again, if you like the episode, please like, subscribe, write comments. Tell us what you agree with. Tell us what you disagree with. But, jump on YouTube. Say, hey, I hate it when you say that. Great. Let's have a conversation. That's the whole point of this thing. So enjoy you all. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time, we'll see you later, you derelicts.